talking specifically about The Rhinoceros by a playwright named Eugene Ionesco. And I'm going to focus on existentialism and then specifically also alienation from both a philosophical and a psychological perspective. I do want to say that Eugene Ionesco in many ways during his life rejected existentialism, and he absolutely did not like Sartre and many of his followers. But there is a lot in The Rhinoceros that is very existential and very much aligns with Jean-Paul Sartre as well as Albert Camus, and of course Beckett. I would say the three big figureheads of existentialism in literature. So the first question is, who is Eugene Ionesco? He was certainly very popular, I would say, during the 50s and 60s. I don't know if he ends up on a lot of course curriculum these days, especially in the United States, maybe more so in France and perhaps the United Kingdom. He was born in Romania, although I do believe his mother had some French origins. He died actually in 1994. He did spend his childhood in France, and of note during his childhood in France, he had this, what he didn't describe it as an out-of-body experience, but the way in which he spoke about it, it was clearly an out-of-body experience. And he wrote actually in his memoirs, so he was in France and he was a child at the time. This is a quote: "I was walking in summer sunshine in a whitewashed provincial village under an intense blue sky. I was profoundly altered by the light." He had this sense that he was actually floating up in the air, and he had this realization that the real world was decay, corruption, and meaningless, repetitive action. He became very dissatisfied with the world, and I think this led him to seek out literature as a way of escaping the drudgery of the world that he discovered in having this out-of-body experience. He ended up getting a degree in French literature from the University of Bucharest, so he spent his childhood in France and then he ended up going back to Romania. He started writing plays relatively late in life, not until his 40s, much like Beckett. And he wrote, or that he was classified in the Theater of the Absurd. And absurd has an existential meaning, but absurd also means, the way it normally means in English as well, as something funny, something so crazy that it's funny. And he definitely did a play on both the philosophical aspects of absurdism as well as the standard cultural definition of absurdism, which would be something that you would laugh at or have fun with. So I'm going to give you a summary of The Rhinoceros, and there is a spoiler alert. I am going to give away the ending, but I think enough people are familiar to a certain extent with The Rhinoceros, and I think knowing what happens in the end is not going to alter your reading of the play. In fact, it might contribute to getting more out of the play if you do in fact read it. I want to touch on something from his biography which relates to The Rhinoceros. And at the age of 40, Ionesco began to learn English by copying out sentences, English sentences, and this is how he was trying to learn English. And in the process of copying out all these English sentences, he said he learned that there were 7 days in the week that the ceiling was up and the floor was down. And he said he learned other truths. So I think I found this to be an interesting fact because it seemed like language was helping him deal with reality. Language made makes reality concrete. We have in the West, in Western culture, we have very specific definitions of time. We have a strong orientation to time. There have been other cultures in the past, maybe a few current cultures, isolated cultures. There's one isolated culture in the Amazon where they absolutely have no language for time. But in the West, we have a very strong we have a very strong definition of time. We have many, many words in the West and its languages to define time. And so in a way, he learned that language carved reality and made things true, and it impacted us from a psychological perspective, because the language, the words, changed our way of thinking about things. So I just wanted to bring that biographical note up about him, because I think it relates to the rhinoceros. So let me just give you a rough summary. It begins with a man named Berenger, or Beranger, if you would pronounce it in French. And he has a friend who doesn't seem to be a very good friend. And Berenger drinks a lot, and he's often late to work. He finds no value in his work. There's a woman at his work that he kind of has romantic inclinations to, but he thinks that he's not good enough for her. And his friend chastises him for drinking and generally being untidy. Berenger, kind of reacts like, oh yeah, I know, I shouldn't drink so much, but what else am I going to do? And he also focuses in the beginning of the play on the dullness of his work. And he's often late to work because he's been drinking the night before. And he also has a drink in the morning. And it starts in a cafe, and he does end up having, I do believe, as I recall from the play, he ended up having some brandy. But at the beginning of this play, a rhinoceros runs across the stage. If you can imagine it being staged with a person with a rhinoceros mask on. And a rhinoceros runs across the stage. And actually, the rhinoceros ends up trampling one of the village woman's cats, and the cat dies. So in this first act, there's also a character called the logician, and he has this ridiculous conversation with a person from the city or the village, where he's talking about what makes a cat a cat. It's 4 legs, and somebody says, well, a dog also has 4 legs, so that a dog is a cat and a cat is a dog. The logician uses something that is called in philosophy a syllogism. So it's basically 3 maxims, and the logician arrives at a very absurd conclusion. And as they saw the rhinoceros go across, they begin this argument. Many characters in the play in this first act begin this argument as to whether or not the rhinoceros is an Asiatic rhinoceros or an African rhinoceros. And they said, well, an Asiatic rhinoceros has 2 horns, and an African rhinoceros has 1 horn. And then another character says, no, it's the other way around. The point is that they're making a very minor distinction. It's a rhinoceros. The number of horns seems to be really unimportant. The bigger question is, why is there a rhinoceros running through the city? And there appears to be no causative factor, and that's something very important to understand, is that there is no explanation ever in the play as to why people start turning into an animal, a rhinoceros. In a lot of superhero movies, I'm not really into superhero movies, and I know the basics: Superman, Batman, all the others. There's always a causative factor for how they get their superpowers. In this play, there is no causative factor for the reason why people turn into rhinoceroses. And in another story, which I will talk about in another lecture, The Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka, there is in fact no causative factor for why he turns into a giant insect. It's just something that happens, and there's no explanation for it. In the next act, we have Berenger, who's at work, and of course he's late for work. And then there's an issue with the boss not being there, and more people, they are discovering more people are turning into a rhinoceros. And a client comes into the office, and she's concerned about her husband. And she discovers that her husband has turned into a rhinoceros, and he has tried to go up the stairs to reach the office, and he destroys the stairs. So the rhinoceros, which some of the people are beginning to think have a sort of beauty to them, we also begin to learn that this beauty is very short-lived because they quickly become destructive. And if you remember, as I said, in Act 1, a rhinoceros had killed a cat. So right from the start, there is a destructiveness to the rhinoceros, but as they multiply, they become less beautiful or unique or remarkable, and they become increasingly more destructive. In the last act, one of the characters, Daisy, ends up visiting Berenger, and she's the romantic interest. And she asks him about his drinking habits. He's like, oh, no, I haven't had brandy at all. She's like, well, okay, well, you haven't been drinking in a while. Maybe you deserve some brandy. So she pours him a little brandy, and that's the end of that. But then they end up declaring their love for each other. But very quickly, they're realizing that more and more people are turning into rhinoceroses, and it's almost citywide. And Daisy, we never know if Daisy turns into a rhinoceros, but she leaves the apartment, the home of Berenger. After they've declared love to each other, she leaves in a very apathetic way, and she's almost resigned herself to the fact that that most of the city has now become rhinoceroses. And he actually had tried calling the police, and there's only these odd sounds that he can hear. So there's no human voice that he can detect. Again, this is similar to The Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka, where he tries to, as a giant insect, he's asked questions by his family, and he tries to speak and communicate with them, but it's just these weird, bizarre sounds and that nobody understands. And Berenger doesn't understand, of course, these weird sounds he hears on phones, but he knows that finally it's all over. Everybody has become a rhinoceros. It's finished. And he stands in front of the mirror, and he finally decides a couple things: that he's not going to drink. He also commits himself to saving humanity. He's going to be the last sane person, the last human, and he's going to hold out to the very bitter end, despite the fact that there are rhinoceroses everywhere. He's going to hold on, and he's made this decision. He's made a decision to act. He has recognized that he has a freedom to either become a rhinoceros or to remain a human being, and he chooses to remain a human being. And even if he is alone and completely alienated from everybody else, he is going to, in the end, be representative of all of humanity, and he is going to save humanity by not becoming a rhinoceros. All right, so in Act 1, we are introduced to a character called the Logician. He has no actual name other than the Logician, and he is talking and defining about a syllogism with another gentleman. So you can imagine on the stage, the way this is set up, there is a cafe where Berenger and his friend are sitting, and his friend is being very dismissive and critical of Berenger, and Berenger is kind of putting up with it because he realizes that, you know, he is indeed a very flawed individual, and he is drinking too much, and he's being late for work, and he hasn't found meaning in his life, and he can't approach his love interest, and so his friend is being very very critical. And at the same time, there's another conversation going on the stage that Berenger is also hearing pieces of, the dialogue, where the logician is talking to an old gentleman. And reading from the play exactly, the logician says, where he attempts to define a syllogism, and he says, here's an example of a syllogism. The cat has 4 paws. Isidore and Fricot both have 4 paws. Therefore, Isidore and Fricot are cats. And then the old gentleman says to the logician, my dog has got 4 paws. And the logician says, without missing a beat, then it's a cat. This is a very funny argument. So a syllogism basically is a set of propositions. You have 2 propositions and then a conclusion, and it needs to be logical. So the idea of, if something has 4 paws, then it is a cat. Therefore, all things with 4 paws are a cat. But then the old man says, but then my dog has 4 paws. And then the logician realizes, I don't know if he actually realizes it in the play, the utter absurdity of his own syllogism. It makes absolutely no sense. But Berenger's hearing pieces of this, and he thinks the logician knows what he's talking about, which is why towards the end of the play, when everybody is choosing to become a rhinoceros, he wants to reach out to the logician to explain why this is happening. But we will know early on that the logician is not going to be much help or make any sense whatsoever, because he's coming up with ridiculous and illogical arguments, and he's making what are called false syllogisms. And then what ensues, so then a rhinoceros runs past and it kills a cat. So they notice the beauty of the rhinoceros, but the rhinoceros is going very fast and it kicks up dirt, and then it tramples over a cat, this woman's cat, and she's very disturbed about this. But then begins this long discussion in the play in Act 1 whether the rhinoceroses are Asiatic or African. And so the logician says, the Asiatic rhinoceros has 1 horn and the African rhinoceros has 2 horns. And then somebody says, oh wait, I thought it was the other way around. And then the logician says, no, perhaps it is the other way around. No, it's this way around. And so they're having this rather long discussion over Asiatic or African rhinoceroses, and playing into the fact that this is the Theater of the Absurd. It's actually a pretty funny exchange, and you have to wonder what the point of it is. And so this play very much addresses Nazism and fascism, and I think in the end why Ionesco added the Asiatic versus African debate into the play is that it's a very minor difference between these rhinos. One has 1 horn and another rhinoceros has 2 horns. It's a minor difference because it doesn't matter. They're still a rhinoceros. So if you can think about Nazi Germany and the rise of fascism and people committing to that line of thought and certain actions and making choices, humans are going to have a variation and differences between themselves. But those minor variations between human beings in the face of ideology really don't matter that much if you're dedicated to the ideology overall. And I think that is, in fact, what Ionesco is trying to explain in this debate over Asiatic or African rhinoceroses, is that the minor differences are in fact minor, and it doesn't matter. They're still a beast. And initially they're described by someone as beautiful beasts, but then we learn later in the play that they can become increasingly destructive. So we have this theme in Ionesco's play of love. So we learn early on in Act 1 that Berenger has a love for Daisy, whom he works with. And we also learn early on in the play that he feels that he's unworthy of her love. And Ionesco presents the notion, the idea, the theme of love in a very human way. And in Act 3, Daisy visits Berenger to check on him. Now, none of them have been able to go to work because the stairs to the office have been destroyed by a client's husband who had turned into a rhinoceros, and then the client who was in the office leaves down the damaged stairs, and we assume that she has also become a rhinoceros and joined her husband. But in Act 3, Berenger says to Daisy, "I adore you, Daisy. I admire you as well." And then they have this exchange where they both say, "Oh, I love you, I love you." It's sort of a mutual love, though we still question the depth of Daisy's love. And then she asks him about, have you been good? Meaning, has he been drinking? He's like, no, I've been good. I haven't been drinking very much. She says, well, then you can have a little brandy. It doesn't really say whether he actually starts drinking the brandy, but we know what's important about this is that we know that Berenger is already starting to change in the face of all the absurdity of all these people turning into rhinoceroses. He is trying to stop drinking. He's trying to be a better person. He gets some respite from his dull work because nobody can go back to work. The stairs are damaged. And so he also has time to think and to just, be a human being. And he's trying to be a human being in spite of all the insanity that is happening around him. And there is this quote from Daisy. So she says, well, then we have a right to live. We even owe ourselves a duty to be happy in spite of everything. Guilt is a dangerous symptom. It shows a lack of purity. So the question is, from that statement, how do we live? We have a right to live, but how do we live? And how are we to be happy? How can we be happy in spite of everything? And towards the end of the play, Daisy and Berenger, after they declare their love, and then they learn that nearly everyone has turned into a rhinoceros, there's kind of a cooling period with Daisy, and she sort of feels out of love. She falls out of love very quickly, it seems, with Berenger. And she says of the rhinoceroses, they are like gods. And it ends with her leaving Berenger's apartment. And we're not quite sure if she chooses to become a rhinoceros, but it seems to be heading that way. She doesn't actually declare that she's going to do it, but she became upset with Berenger. And she also, even despite the destructiveness of the rhinoceroses, she thinks they are like gods. And this is somewhat disturbing to Berenger. And we think, though it's not really written into the play, we think that he actually starts to question a bit his relationship with Daisy, and also to question the depth of his own love for Daisy. So the answer, can love save you, is a complicated one, because on the one hand you can say, yes, to love is human. It makes you less lonely. There's all kinds of positive aspects to love. But will it actually save you in the face of insanity, in the face of absurdity, in the face of all the trials and tribulations of life? Can love actually save you? We're not clear. It's not clear from the play whether or not that is what Ionesco is saying. But what he is very clearly saying is that love is a very human emotion. It's not going to be the automatic thing that saves you in this world. So I had explained early on when I was giving you the biography of Eugene Ionesco is that he sort of rejected existentialism. He wasn't in the Sartre camp. He wasn't even in the Albert Camus camp. I think he accepted nearly all of the tenets of existentialism. I think he just saw it as another ideology, a philosophy as an ideology, and he wanted no part of being part of an ideology. Ideologies can be dangerous things, as he saw in Nazi Germany. So I think his issue with existentialism wasn't necessarily the tenets of existentialism, existentialism, but that he refused to be boxed in to a certain ideology. But we do learn at the very end of Act 3, Berenger's looking in the mirror, and he realizes that he is free. And Sartre had held that we are condemned to be free. Berenger recognizes his freedom and his freedom to choose not to be a rhinoceros. And he also, as he's staring in the mirror, making this decision, he's also just realizing that he, in making this choice, is making a decision for all of humanity. And Sartre actually wrote about this in his essay, Existentialism as a Humanism, that the acts that we choose, what we choose for our lives, actually ripples out in society, and it makes an impact on all of humanity, the things that we do. The other part of existentialism is that devoid of a God or a set of values and being condemned to be free, life kind of makes no sense. But we have to make sense of it. It is something that we can do. We can make meaning out of our lives. We can make sense out of our lives. And as Berenger's sort of staring in the mirror, he's wrestling with all of this, and he's realizing that he's going to make a meaning out of his life, and he's also choosing to save humanity and not become a rhinoceros. I want to quote Albert Camus. He wrote that I draw from the absurd three consequences: my revolt, my liberty, my passion. So we see this in Berenger. He revolts against the move that is happening all around him of people becoming rhinoceroses. He recognizes his freedom, and in so doing, he recognizes his passion to save humanity. So the main theme, I think, from Alienation, and this also makes the rhinoceros similar to Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis, which I had mentioned, but in a flipped over manner. So we have this concept of alienation. There is a philosophical definition of it. Hegel described alienation as a process. So we begin life alienated, and we go from self-estrangement to self-recognition. And it is a process. So Hegel had famously created this dialectical philosophy, and he also wrote a lot about the master-slave relationship, which some therapists have taken that the master-slave relationship is sort of this struggle, this transference, counter-transference, going back and forth. But you can also sort of see this going on if you take a Freudian perspective, where you're wrestling with yourself, your id, your ego, your superego. You're going through this process of from alienation to finally self-recognition, where you've sort of developed self-awareness and you've integrated all the parts of your personality. Heidegger had a little bit of a different view of alienation, and I'm not going to go into any depth with Heidegger. He's actually a very hard philosopher to kind of dive into. But in his book, which I have not read in its entirety, but I've read a good portion of it, he talks about overcoming alienation by achieving authenticity. And Heidegger loved that word, authenticity. He talks about it in numerous different aspects. And if we take this back to Berenger, we can say that he actually did achieve authenticity and ended his alienation, because he developed his self. He chose his self by not being a rhinoceros, and recognizing his passion, which the quote from Albert Camus, and recognizing his passion to save humanity, he discovered his own authenticity. So even though Daisy has walked out of his life, they had briefly declared their love for each other, and then she walks out of his life. So without love, he has still managed to end alienation, this self-estrangement, because he has guidance, he has purpose. He no longer needs to drink, and he no longer has to work at an unfulfilling job. and he's discovered his passion. So he's achieved authenticity. And even though it seems like Berenger is entirely alone in the world, in a world gone completely mad, and in the face of absurdity, he's managed to end his alienation by achieving his authenticity. Now, alienation is also psychological, and the definition differs from the philosophical one to the psychological one. So typically alienation occurs when a person withdraws or becomes isolated from their environment. So we can say Berenger is experiencing extreme isolation in the face of all this absurdity around him. Psychologically, people will often reject loved ones. They'll reject society. Berenger doesn't reject Daisy. He's actually still sort of pining for her, but he is building up to rejecting society and the craziness around him. But alienation is very complex, and it's philosophical, sociological, and psychological. And it can have some very dramatic impacts on your mental health, and it can also aggravate medical conditions. Treatment for alienation is usually done through therapy, not necessarily through medication. I will talk about some of the psychological symptoms of alienation, and some of those we do see in Berenger. So some of the symptoms of psychological alienation, I've sort of listed them out for you. Feeling helpless, feeling that the world is empty or meaningless, feeling left out of conversations or events, feeling different or separate from everyone, having difficulty approaching and speaking with others, feeling unsafe when interacting with others, refusing to obey rules, and there could also be symptoms of depression, which include having a poor appetite or overeating, sleeping excessively or having insomnia, being fatigued, lacking self-worth, and having feelings of hopelessness. I will also add to that people will often do drink. They will drink alcohol, like Berenger was drinking alcohol on a daily basis. People may also do drugs to escape feelings of alienation. So it's not just a poor appetite or overeating. People are using other crutches in which to help deal with the symptoms of depression that are stemming from, in fact, your alienation. And in these psychological symptoms of alienation, we see this a lot in Berenger, but we see this in Act 1, Act 2, and then for most of Act 3 until the very last part where he achieves authenticity and thereby ends his alienation. He does have feelings of helplessness, and to him, he doesn't say life is empty or meaningless, but he does say that life is a dream. He also feels left out of events, but this is the positive aspect for him. He feels left out of this event of absurdity where people are turning into rhinoceroses. So this is actually turning in his advantage by feeling left out, because it actually helps him achieve authenticity in the end, and it ends his overall alienation. He also felt different and separate from everyone else. He didn't have very solid relationships with anyone. His supposed friend was always very hypercritical of him. And the other symptom that I want to point out is a refusal to obey rules. So people who are alienated are withdrawing from society and the rules of society. And Berenger is in fact also doing the same thing. He's withdrawing. He stays in his apartment when he can no longer go back to work because of the damaged stairs. He has days off, and he's feeling very isolated, and he's withdrawn from society, and he's questioning the rules of society and the absurdity around him. So this is the psychological approach to alienation, and it's different than, of course, the philosophical one, but at the end you can actually marry the two, because it's still the same thing. What could help you end alienation is not so much love, which is one of the themes in Rhinoceros, love does not actually end up saving Berenger in the end. It is accepting his own freedom to make meaning out of life and discovering his own passion, which is in this case to save humanity. And that ends his alienation, and the key point is that he has achieved authenticity at that point. All right, so what's the main takeaway of this play? So you could look at it as a piece of existentialism, something that helps you explore the philosophy of existentialism. You can look at it as an exploration of the psychological symptoms of alienation. You could look at it from the theme of love, but you could also look at it in terms of ideology, and this being Ionesco's response to Nazism and fascism that nearly destroyed Europe during World War II. But I think what you need to understand is that this play is also funny. It could be staged in a very funny way. It's not super serious. We learn that from the ridiculous conversations of the logician in Act 1. So you really should approach the play with kind of a light heart. It's a little playful, and it's meant to be funny. And I think that is a key takeaway from the Theater of the Absurd. Maybe a little less so from Beckett, but definitely from Ionesco. There's a lot of humor, and humor is an important way to deal with life and absurdities. And we know that humor can relieve symptoms of depression, and we also know that it's psychologically healthy to laugh and not be overly serious all the time. In light of current politics in the United States and actually globally, there's a lot of very difficult things going on in countries around the world. But I find myself every night, every weekday night, before I go to bed, I look on my tablet and I look up all the late night shows and comedians, and I watch their intro monologues, and they remark about world events and politics in the United States, and they do it in a way that's very funny. And so during the day, I'll read the news and I'm not laughing. And late at night, right before I go to bed, I watch the comedians sort of make fun of the state of our country, the state of our world, and I laugh. And quite honestly, I feel better. So reading the news made me feel hopeless, but watching the comedians made me feel better. So I go to bed on a much lighter note. So I think this is the important part of this play, and probably absurdism in general, is that you need to remember to laugh and not take things so seriously. If in fact the people in the play, the Rhinoceros, had taken the issue of this transformation into a rhinoceros less seriously, if they had paid a little bit less attention and stopped arguing about, well, do they have one horn or two horns, this Asiatic versus African debate, maybe if they had just maybe laughed a little, and, well, wasn't that funny? A rhinoceros just ran right there down. That is hilarious. Maybe if they had laughed about it, the outcome would have been a little different. Maybe they wouldn't have actually had become rhinoceroses. People would have made a different choice if they could have seen the humor in the situation. So I will end on that. I suggest reading the play. There's a lot in it. There's a lot that I actually didn't address that I could have addressed. Some of the dialogue is very profound. It's probably one of the best plays of the 20th century. I highly suggest reading it. You can get psychological aspects from it, you can get philosophical aspects from it, but also you learn about absurdity, and you learn the key point, and that the key point is don't forget to laugh. Life is very serious. It seems very serious if you look at it very clearly, like Ionesco, when he said when he was learning English, he learned that the ceiling was up and the floor was down. Language makes things very concrete, but humor can make things a little more ambiguous, and it can pull you back and give you this out-of-body experience that Ionesco had experienced when he was a young kid, where he saw the beauty of life and he felt himself floating up. So humor can kind of do the same thing for you. It can give you distance from current events, and it can make you laugh, which is a bit of an out-of-body experience, because if you are in the thick of the political events going on around us, you feel very serious and very unhappy. And this play teaches you to laugh.